Mother's Day morning, May 10th, 2020. Suzanne Morphew wakes up in her beautiful Colorado mountain home in Salida. Her two daughters are away on a church camping trip, so it's just her and her husband Barry for the holiday. By 6:30 a.m., she's already texting with someone special, sending a selfie that would become the last digital trace of her life. The quiet mountain air carries the promise of a perfect spring day for a bike ride through the scenic trails she loves. But before we dive deeper, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. By 1:30 that afternoon, Barry Morphew calls 911. His wife went for a bike ride and never came back. Her mountain bike was found thrown in a ravine. Her helmet discovered separately, placed carefully on the ground. No signs of a crash. No evidence of an accident, just a woman who vanished without a trace on the day meant to celebrate mothers everywhere. The search began immediately. Hundreds of volunteers combed the rugged Colorado wilderness. Barry joined news interviews, pleading for his wife's safe return. For 3.5 years, it seemed like Suzanne Morphew had simply disappeared into the mountains she loved. But this wasn't a random disappearance. The real story started months before that Mother's Day morning when a 20-year marriage began cracking under the weight of secrets, control, and a husband who couldn't let go. This is Accused, where we dig into the cases that matter and uncover the truth behind the headlines. Hit that subscribe button if you want the real story, not just what makes the news. The Suzanne Morphew case divided a small Colorado community for 5 years. A beloved teacher and mother vanished on Mother's Day. A husband who seemed devoted, but whose story kept changing. A massive investigation that generated over 1,400 tips and involved more than 70 officers from multiple agencies. Today, we're going to show you the digital evidence that finally exposed the truth. The phone records that revealed Barry's lies, the financial records that showed his motive, the chemical evidence found in Suzanne's bones that only one person in the entire region had access to. The timeline that proves this was never about a bike ride gone wrong. This is the story of how a Mother's Day disappearance became a calculated murder, and how modern technology finally caught a killer who thought he'd committed the perfect crime. Suzanne Morphew was 49 years old when she disappeared. Friends described her as vivacious, caring, and someone who was finally starting to find herself again after years of raising her two daughters. She'd recently earned her teaching certificate and was planning to start a new career in education. For the first time in decades, Suzanne was building her own financial independence. But behind the picture-perfect Colorado life was a marriage that had been falling apart for years. Barry Morphew, her husband of over 2 decades, was a businessman who'd moved the family from Indiana to Colorado in 2018. What looked like a fresh start in the mountains was actually an attempt to escape mounting financial problems and Barry's increasingly controlling behavior. By 2019, Barry had started monitoring Suzanne's phone calls and text messages. He tracked her movements and isolated her from friends. The financial stress was enormous. Their landscaping business was failing and they were drowning in debt. But the real breaking point came when Suzanne reconnected with an old high school friend on social media. What started as innocent messages between former classmates quickly became something more. Suzanne had found someone who listened to her, who treated her with respect she hadn't felt in years. By early 2020, she was secretly planning to leave Barry. She was researching divorce lawyers, opening her own bank accounts, and working toward the financial independence that would let her start over. Barry knew about the affair. He'd discovered the secret communications, and his world was crashing down. The woman he'd controlled for decades was slipping away, and with her would go everything: the house, the assets, and his image as the devoted husband. By May 2020, Suzanne was just days away from asking for a divorce. She'd even sent Barry a text on May 6th saying, "I'm done. I could care less what you're up to and have been for years. We just need to figure this out civilly." But Barry Morphew had other plans for how this marriage would end. The cracks in the Morphew marriage didn't happen overnight. Court documents reveal a systematic pattern of control that escalated dramatically in the months before Suzanne's disappearance. Barry wasn't just a jealous husband, he was a man watching his entire world slip away, and he was willing to do anything to stop it. The financial pressure started building in 2019. Barry's landscaping business was hemorrhaging money. They owed thousands in unpaid bills, their credit was shot, and the beautiful Colorado home they'd bought was becoming a financial burden they couldn't afford. But Barry had an image to maintain in their small mountain community. He was the successful businessman, the devoted family man, the guy who'd made it big enough to afford the mountain lifestyle everyone envied. That's when Barry's controlling behavior ramped up to dangerous levels. He installed tracking software on Suzanne's phone without her knowledge. He monitored her social media accounts, read her private messages, and started showing up unexpectedly wherever she went. Friends later told investigators that Suzanne had become increasingly isolated. Barry would find reasons she couldn't attend social gatherings, couldn't visit friends, couldn't have the independent life she was trying to build. The affair discovery changed everything. When Barry found those secret messages between Suzanne and her high school friend, it wasn't just about jealousy. This was about losing control of the one thing he thought he could always count on: his wife's dependence on him. Suzanne wasn't just having an emotional affair. She was planning her escape, and Barry could see exactly how she was going to do it through those intercepted messages. By March 2020, Suzanne was actively researching divorce lawyers in Colorado. She was looking into the state's property division laws, trying to figure out how to protect herself financially when she left. She'd started moving small amounts of money into a separate account Barry didn't know about. She was building the foundation for a life without him, step by careful step. But Barry was watching every move. The man who'd controlled every aspect of their marriage for 2 decades wasn't about to let her just walk away. Court records show he'd been researching something else entirely during this same time period. While Suzanne was planning her new life, Barry was researching ways to make sure she'd never get the chance to live it. The evidence would later show he'd been looking into untraceable methods of murder, chemicals that wouldn't show up in standard toxicology tests, and ways to stage accidents in the Colorado wilderness. The final escalation came in early May 2020. Suzanne's affair partner was planning to visit Colorado. They were going to meet in person for the first time in decades, and Suzanne was planning to tell him about her decision to leave Barry. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. This was about Suzanne having the support system and emotional courage to actually go through with it. For Barry, this meeting represented the end of everything he'd worked to control. May 9th, 2020, the day before Mother's Day. Suzanne Morphew sends her last selfie to her affair partner at 2:11 p.m. She's smiling, sitting in her car, looking happier than she had in years. She has no idea this photo will become key evidence in a murder investigation. She has no idea her husband has been planning her death for weeks. That evening, Barry claims he's preparing for an early morning work trip to Denver. He tells Suzanne he has a landscaping job that will keep him away until Sunday afternoon, convenient timing that would give him an alibi for whatever happened to his wife. But phone records tell a completely different story. Barry's cell phone data shows he never left the Salida area that night. While he claimed to be sleeping in a Denver hotel, his phone was pinging cell towers near their home. Here's where the timeline gets crucial. At 2:47 a.m. on May 10th, Mother's Day morning, Barry's phone goes into airplane mode. This isn't an accident. This is a man who knows that cell phone data can track his movements, and he's trying to create a gap in the digital record of where he was and what he was doing. The phone stays in airplane mode for hours, during the exact time window when investigators believe Suzanne was murdered. But Barry made a critical mistake. His truck had GPS tracking through the vehicle's telematics system, technology he didn't even know existed. While his phone was dark, his truck was recording every mile he drove, every stop he made, every turn he took through the Colorado mountains in the early hours of Mother's Day morning. The data shows Barry driving to remote locations, stopping for extended periods, then driving to different remote locations. This wasn't a landscaping job. This was a man disposing of evidence and hiding a body. At 6:30 a.m., Suzanne's phone shows its last activity. She's not making calls or sending texts. The phone is just moving through the house, as if someone is carrying it around, trying to make it look like she's going about her normal morning routine. Investigators believe this is Barry, manipulating his dead wife's phone to create a false timeline of her last hours alive. By 9 a.m., Barry's phone comes back online. Suddenly, he's texting Suzanne, asking about her plans for the day, acting like the concerned husband wondering what his wife is up to. But Suzanne never responds to these messages. She'll never respond to anything again because she's already been dead for hours. The staged bike ride comes next. Barry claims Suzanne told him she was going for a bike ride that morning. He says he left for his work trip before she went out, so he doesn't know exactly which trail she chose. But the physical evidence at the bike scene tells a different story. The bike was thrown into a ravine with such force that it couldn't have been an accident. The helmet was placed separately, carefully positioned where it would be easily found. There were no skid marks, no signs of a crash, no evidence that anyone had ever actually ridden that bike on the trail where it was discovered. At 1:30 p.m., Barry calls 911 to report his wife missing. But here's the thing. He doesn't sound like a panicked husband who just discovered his wife never came home from her bike ride. He sounds like a man going through the motions of a script he's already rehearsed. Question for you. Your spouse goes missing during what should be a routine activity. Do you immediately join every search party and volunteer effort, spend every waking moment looking for them, and cooperate fully with investigators? Or do you hire a criminal defense lawyer within 48 hours, start selling their personal belongings within weeks, and refuse to take a polygraph test? Keep that choice in mind as we see exactly how Barry Morphew responded to his wife's disappearance, because his actions in those first crucial weeks told investigators everything they needed to know about what really happened to Suzanne. The search for Suzanne Morphew became one of the largest missing person investigations in Colorado history. Over 1,400 tips poured in from the public. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation deployed their best digital forensics experts. The FBI brought in specialized search teams trained in recovering bodies in wilderness terrain. Hundreds of volunteers combed through miles of rugged mountain trails, hoping to find any trace of the missing mother. But while an entire community was desperately searching for Suzanne, her husband was behaving in ways that made investigators increasingly suspicious. Within 48 hours of reporting his wife missing, Barry Morphew had hired a criminal defense attorney. Think about that timing. Most innocent spouses are focused entirely on the search efforts, on getting their loved one's face in the media, on cooperating with every possible avenue of investigation. Barry was focused on protecting himself legally. The red flags started piling up fast. When investigators asked Barry to take a polygraph test, he refused. When they wanted to search the family home more thoroughly, his lawyer objected. When they requested his cell phone records, he fought the subpoena. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate husband trying to find his missing wife. This was the behavior of a suspect trying to avoid getting caught. But the most damning evidence of Barry's guilt came from what he did with Suzanne's personal belongings. While search teams were still combing the mountains looking for her, Barry was quietly selling her possessions. Her jewelry, her clothes, personal items that any innocent spouse would preserve hoping for their loved one's return. Barry was getting rid of all of it. He listed items for sale online, held garage sales, and disposed of anything that reminded the world that Suzanne Morphew had ever existed. The digital forensics investigation revealed even more disturbing patterns. Barry's internet search history in the weeks before Suzanne's disappearance included queries about body decomposition, how long DNA evidence lasts in outdoor environments, and whether certain chemicals could be detected in standard autopsy procedures. These weren't the searches of an innocent man worried about his missing wife. These were the searches of someone planning a murder and trying to avoid getting caught. Phone records showed that Barry had been systematically deleting text messages and call logs, particularly any communications related to his wife's affair or their marriage problems. He'd also been using encrypted messaging apps and creating fake social media accounts, behavior that made no sense for a landscaping contractor from small-town Colorado unless he had something to hide. But perhaps the most revealing evidence was Barry's behavior during the actual search efforts. While volunteers were hiking dangerous mountain terrain in brutal weather conditions, Barry was notably absent. He would show up for media interviews, always with his lawyer present, but he rarely participated in the physical search for his wife. When he did join search teams, other volunteers noticed he seemed more interested in knowing what areas had already been searched than in actually searching new areas. The financial investigation revealed another motive that investigators couldn't ignore. Barry and Suzanne carried substantial life insurance policies on each other. If Suzanne was declared dead, Barry would receive a significant payout that would solve all his business financial problems. But there was a catch. Most life insurance policies don't pay out if the beneficiary is convicted of murder. Barry needed Suzanne to be declared dead, but he also needed to avoid being charged with her murder. That's why the staged disappearance was so important to his plan. If investigators believed Suzanne had died in a hiking or biking accident in the Colorado wilderness, Barry would collect the insurance money and be free to start over with a clean slate. But if her body was found with evidence of foul play, or if investigators could prove she'd been murdered, Barry's financial motivation would become obvious. As the investigation continued through 2020 and into 2021, the evidence against Barry kept mounting. Digital forensics experts recovered deleted files from his computers showing he'd been researching divorce laws in Colorado and ways to hide assets from a spouse. They found evidence he'd been creating fake business documents to make their financial situation look worse than it was, possibly to reduce what Suzanne would be entitled to in a divorce settlement. The case was building toward an arrest, but investigators knew they needed more evidence to ensure a conviction. Without Suzanne's body, they would have to prove murder using only circumstantial evidence, and that's always a challenging case to win in court. They needed the smoking gun that would make Barry's guilt undeniable. The breakthrough in the Suzanne Morphew case came from an unexpected source: Barry's own admission about his hobby of tranquilizing deer. During one of his interviews with investigators, Barry casually mentioned that he used animal tranquilizers on his property to sedate deer before removing their antlers. He talked about it like it was completely normal, just part of managing wildlife on his Colorado land. But investigators immediately recognized the significance of this admission. Animal tranquilizers are incredibly dangerous to humans. The chemicals Barry described, butorphanol, azaparone, and medetomidine, known collectively as BAM, are powerful enough to sedate animals weighing hundreds of pounds. In humans, even small doses can cause respiratory failure and death within minutes. More importantly, these chemicals are virtually impossible to detect without specific testing, and they break down quickly in the human body. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation started digging into Barry's access to these tranquilizers. What they found was damning. Prescription records showed that Barry was the only private citizen in the entire south-central Colorado region who had purchased BAM in the years leading up to Suzanne's disappearance. He'd bought multiple kits of the tranquilizer cocktail when he lived in Indiana, where he ran a deer farm, and he'd brought those supplies with him to Colorado. Even more incriminating, investigators found that Barry had used these tranquilizers as recently as April 2020, just 1 month before Suzanne disappeared. He'd told neighbors he tranquilized a deer near their home's breezeway, the exact area where investigators believed Suzanne had been attacked. Barry had essentially given them a practice run for what he would do to his wife just weeks later. The search of the Morphew home revealed additional evidence that painted a terrifying picture. Hidden in Barry's workshop, investigators found tranquilizer dart guns and associated equipment. These weren't the tools of someone who occasionally helped with wildlife management. This was a complete arsenal for chemical immobilization, sophisticated enough to take down large animals, or a human being. By May 2021, investigators had enough evidence to make their move. Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant. The arrest came exactly 1 year after Suzanne's disappearance, and it sent shockwaves through the small Colorado community that had been divided about Barry's innocence. But the case was far from over. Barry's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorneys, immediately began attacking the prosecution's evidence. They argued that everything against Barry was circumstantial. Yes, he had access to tranquilizers, but that didn't prove he used them on his wife. Yes, his behavior after Suzanne's disappearance was suspicious, but suspicious behavior isn't the same as murder. Without Suzanne's body, without direct physical evidence of her death, they claimed the prosecution couldn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal battle that followed would expose serious problems in the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys discovered that prosecutors had withheld crucial evidence, including DNA from an unknown male found in Suzanne's car. They revealed that the investigation had focused so intensely on Barry that other potential suspects and leads had been ignored. The case that seemed so strong was starting to unravel, and Barry's attorneys were confident they could create enough reasonable doubt to win an acquittal. What nobody knew at the time was that the most important evidence in the case was still buried in a shallow grave 40 miles away, waiting to be discovered. Just as Barry Morphew's murder trial was about to begin in April 2022, the case took a shocking turn that nobody saw coming. The prosecution, led by 11th Judicial District Attorney Linda Stanley, filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Barry without prejudice. The trial that the community had been waiting for, the justice that Suzanne's family had been seeking, was suddenly canceled just days before jury selection was supposed to start. The reason for the dismissal revealed serious problems with how the case had been handled from the beginning. Judge Ramsey Lama had ruled that prosecutors could not call most of their key expert witnesses because they had repeatedly violated discovery rules. The prosecution team had failed to turn over crucial evidence to Barry's defense attorneys, including DNA evidence that could potentially point to other suspects.
The most damaging revelation was that investigators had found male DNA in Suzanne's car that didn't match Barry, and this evidence had been hidden from the defense for months. Under Colorado law, prosecutors are required to share any evidence that could potentially exonerate a defendant. But the DNA evidence had been buried in thousands of pages of discovery documents in a way that made it nearly impossible for defense attorneys to find. But the prosecutorial misconduct went much deeper than just hiding evidence. District Attorney Linda Stanley had been making public statements about the case that were designed to prejudice potential jurors against Barry. She appeared on true crime podcasts and television shows, discussing details of the case that should never have been made public. She presented theories about Barry's guilt as if they were established facts, even though the evidence was still being evaluated. Even more shocking, investigators discovered that Stanley and her team had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of Judge Lama himself. They believed the judge was biased against their case because he had ruled against them on several key motions, so they started investigating his personal life and financial records, looking for anything they could use to have him removed from the case. This behavior was so far outside the bounds of proper prosecutorial conduct that it bordered on criminal. The dismissal of the case was a devastating blow to Suzanne's family and to the community members who believed Barry was guilty. They had waited 2 years for justice, and now it seemed like Barry might escape consequences entirely because of the prosecution's incompetence and misconduct. Barry was released from jail, his ankle monitor was removed, and he was free to rebuild his life while his wife remained missing. Barry's legal team immediately went on the offensive. They filed a $15 million lawsuit against the prosecutors, investigators, and law enforcement agencies involved in the case, claiming malicious prosecution and violation of Barry's civil rights. They argued that their client had been the victim of a rush to judgment by investigators who were under pressure to solve a high-profile case. The fallout from the case dismissal continued for years. Linda Stanley eventually faced disciplinary proceedings for her conduct in the Morphew case. In 2024, she was disbarred by the Colorado Supreme Court after a detailed investigation revealed the full extent of her misconduct. The court found that she had violated multiple rules of professional conduct, made improper public statements, withheld evidence from the defense, and conducted unauthorized investigations of the trial judge.
But while Barry was celebrating his legal victory and the prosecution was dealing with the scandal, investigators never stopped working. The case had been dismissed without prejudice, which meant that if new evidence was discovered, charges could be refiled. Search teams continued looking for Suzanne's body, following up on tips and using new technology to examine areas that had been searched before. Barry seemed confident that he had beaten the system. He moved away from Colorado, started a new life in Arizona, and maintained his innocence in occasional media interviews. He believed that without Suzanne's body, without direct physical evidence of her death, no prosecutor would ever be able to convict him of murder. He was wrong.
September 22nd, 2023. More than 3 years after Suzanne Morphew disappeared, and 17 months after charges against her husband were dismissed, investigators were conducting an unrelated search in Saguache County when they made a discovery that would change everything. In a shallow grave in a remote field about 40 miles from the Morphew home, they found human remains. Within 5 days, dental records confirmed what investigators had hoped and feared. They had found Suzanne Morphew. After more than 3 years of searching hundreds of square miles of rugged Colorado wilderness, Suzanne's body had been discovered in an area that seemed to have no connection to her life or daily activities. This wasn't a place she would have gone hiking or biking. This was a dumping ground, chosen specifically because it was remote and unlikely to be searched. But the discovery of Suzanne's remains raised as many questions as it answered. Forensic experts immediately noticed that the bones were significantly bleached, far more than would be expected from natural decomposition processes. The lack of insect activity, hair and clothing decomposition at the site suggested that Suzanne's body hadn't decomposed at this location. The evidence indicated that she had been killed somewhere else. Her body had decomposed in a different location, and then her bones had been moved to this shallow grave. This discovery meant that Suzanne's body had been moved at least twice after her murder. Barry had initially hidden her remains in one location, probably somewhere on or near their property where he could monitor the decomposition process. Then, at some point over the following months or years, he had dug up her bones and moved them to this remote field in Saguache County. The condition and location of the remains painted a picture of a calculated killer who had planned every aspect of the crime. Barry hadn't just murdered his wife in a moment of rage. He had thought through the disposal of her body, chosen locations that would minimize the chances of discovery, and even planned for the possibility of having to move her remains if his original hiding place became compromised. But the most important evidence came from the autopsy. The El Paso County Coroner's Office conducted extensive testing on Suzanne's remains, including specialized toxicology tests that weren't typically performed in standard autopsies. What they found was the smoking gun that investigators had been looking for since 2020. The autopsy results released in 2024 confirmed what investigators had suspected for years. Suzanne Morphew had been murdered, and the cause of her death was homicide by unspecified means in the setting of butorphanol, azapirone, and medetomidine intoxication. the exact same tranquilizer cocktail that Barry had admitted to using on deer. The presence of these chemicals in Suzanne's bone marrow was the direct physical evidence that prosecutors had been missing in 2022. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or suspicious behavior that could be explained away. This was proof that Suzanne had been killed using tranquilizers that only one person in the entire region had access to: her husband. But the toxicology evidence revealed something even more sinister about how Suzanne died. The presence of metabolites in her system showed that her death wasn't immediate after being exposed to the tranquilizer cocktail. The drugs had begun to be processed by her body before she died, which meant she had been conscious and aware for several minutes after being injected. Investigators believe Barry chased Suzanne around their house after injecting her with the BAM cocktail, and she died knowing that her husband was killing her. The prescription records were equally damning. Investigators had traced every BAM prescription issued in the Colorado region between 2017 and 2020. Only 3 entities had purchased the tranquilizer cocktail during that time period: Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the National Park Service, and Barry Morphew. Barry was literally the only private citizen in the entire area who had legal access to the chemicals found in his wife's body. With this new evidence, the case was transferred to a different judicial district to avoid the prosecutorial misconduct issues that had derailed the first prosecution. In June 2025, a grand jury in Colorado's 12th Judicial District returned a new indictment against Barry Morphew, charging him with first-degree murder in his wife's death. Barry was arrested at his new home in Arizona and is currently being held on $3 million bond while fighting extradition back to Colorado. His defense team has maintained his innocence, but the chemical evidence makes their job significantly more difficult this time around. It's much harder to explain away toxicology results than it is to create doubt about circumstantial evidence.
The new indictment also includes details about the movement of Suzanne's body that weren't available during the first prosecution. Investigators now believe they can prove not just that Barry killed his wife, but that he spent months or years moving her remains to avoid detection. This evidence of ongoing criminal activity after the murder strengthens the prosecution's case and demonstrates the calculated nature of Barry's crime. The case that once seemed impossible to prove has become much stronger with the discovery of Suzanne's remains and the chemical evidence they contained. Barry Morphew, who thought he had committed the perfect crime by using untraceable tranquilizers and hiding the body where it would never be found, is now facing the consequences of his actions. Today, there's a small memorial in Salida, Colorado, where Suzanne Morphew lived and died. Friends and community members still leave flowers there, still remember the vibrant woman who was taken from them on Mother's Day 2020. The memorial serves as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life was cut short by violence. The Suzanne Morphew case shows us how far forensic science has come in solving murders, even when killers think they've outsmarted the system. Cell phone data, vehicle GPS tracking, prescription records, and advanced toxicology testing all came together to expose the truth about what happened to a missing mother. Barry Morphew planned what he thought was the perfect murder, using chemicals that would be nearly impossible to detect and staging a disappearance that looked like a hiking accident. But modern technology doesn't lie. Digital evidence doesn't have emotions or biases. It simply records what happened, and in this case, it recorded the movements of a killer who thought he was too smart to get caught. 5 years after Suzanne disappeared, the truth has finally come out. A husband staged his wife's disappearance on Mother's Day, using animal tranquilizers to murder her, and then spending years moving her body to avoid detection. The loving husband who pleaded for his wife's safe return on television was actually the man who killed her. Tomorrow, we're covering another case that shows how domestic violence can escalate to murder when victims try to leave their abusers. It's a pattern we see over and over again in true crime. The most dangerous time for a victim is when they're planning to escape. Subscribe to Accused for the cases that matter, the investigations that reveal the truth, and the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered.